The story of Thomas Chatterton usually ends right here, dead at 17 in a London garret, a spilled vial of poison on the floor. This photograph shows the actual attic room where Chatterton grew up. Between these cramped, exposed beams, his specific intellect incubated in total isolation. Looking at this 18th century landscape of the city, we see the environment that shaped his mind. Surrounded by Gothic spires and medieval history, he developed an absolute obsession with the English past. The tragedy of his early death often obscures the actual mechanics of his work. Chatterton was a meticulous, albeit deceptive, literary engineer. By building an elaborate, flawed forgery, this teenager inadvertently wrote the code for the entire English Romantic movement. At age 12, Chatterton invented an alter ego, Thomas Rowley, a 15th century monk. He composed original verses, transcribed them onto scraps of church parchment, and claimed he had unearthed lost medieval masterpieces. For a short time, he fooled the British literary establishment. Then, scholars began looking closer at the text itself. They found a glaring contradiction. The vocabulary looked ancient, but the underlying rhythm of the sentences did not. To see exactly how he inadvertently shaped the next century of poetry, we have to forensically deconstruct the flawed source code of his fake medieval language. In 1782, the scholar Edmund Malone published a detailed analysis to prove the Rowley poems were fabrications. Malone realized that Chatterton lacked any genuine fluency in Middle English. Instead, the teenager was manually mining antiquarian dictionaries and glossaries for raw vocabulary. This process led to a strange problem. Malone discovered the text was actually too old and obscure to be authentic to the 1400s. If we break down a single line of Chatterton's poetry, the timeline shatters. He would place a 12th century term next to a 14th century northern provincial dialect word. The result is a completely synthetic dialect. No person in the Middle Ages ever spoke like this. This artificial diction was the fatal flaw that exposed the fraud. It was an 18th century mind guessing at the past, stitching together an alphabet of obsolete terms. But the vocabulary was only half the equation. The syntactic skeleton hiding beneath those words told a different story. If you strip away the obscure vocabulary, the versification flows with the smooth, polished formulas typical of 18th century neoclassical poetry. Chatterton tried to disguise this modern syntax through aggressive, cosmetic revisions to standard spelling. He doubled up consonants without any grammatical reason and sprinkled the letter E liberally to simulate an ancient aesthetic. Ultimately, the Rowley poems failed as forgeries because of structural schizophrenia. They were an ancient linguistic skin stretched tightly over a modern metric skeleton. However, inside that failed forgery, Chatterton was prototyping genuine structural innovations. To construct his medieval world, he looked closely at the 16th century verse of Edmund Spenser. This diagram represents the standard Spenserian stanza, functioning as an architectural block of 9 lines with 3 alternating rhymes. Chatterton expanded this foundation. He added a 10th line, morphing the architecture into a custom structure. This new Raleigh stanza maintains a base of iambic pentameter, but introduces a complex 4-rhyme scheme mapping out to A-B-A-B, B-C-B-C-C-D. He anchors the entire structure with an alexandrine, 12 syllables instead of 10, providing a sweeping, asymmetrical finish. The historical premise was fake, but the math was real.
Chatterton engineered a flexible metric technology that successfully bypassed the rigid rules of neoclassical poetry. That new technical freedom provided a direct blueprint for the Romantics who followed him. Samuel Taylor Coleridge harbored a lifelong obsession with Chatterton's texts, revising a monody to the teenager over several decades. Looking at Chatterton's The Tournament on the left, alongside Coleridge's Christabel on the right, the transmission is visible. Coleridge lifted Chatterton's octosyllabic metric patterns. The influence extends into theme. Chatterton's African eclogues seeded the atmospheric landscape that Coleridge would harvest for Kubla Khan. Even the core premise of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, artificially antiquating a modern verse to give it an eerie, timeless quality, is a direct application of the Rowley methodology. Coleridge treated Chatterton's texts as a technical manual, extracting and utilizing the synthetic medieval mechanics to construct his own major works. John Keats held the same technical reverence for the Bristol teenager, explicitly dedicating his epic poem Endymion to Chatterton's memory. Keats closely studied the sensory details in the Rowley poems, particularly their unpretentious connection to natural metaphors. In September 1819, Keats hit an artistic wall. He felt his own draft of the poem Hyperion was suffocating under rigid, artificial structures. He abandoned the draft entirely to strip out what he called its Miltonic inversions. He realized he needed the language of Chatterton, which he declared the purest and most genuine English idiom. This reveals a striking historical irony. A dialect built entirely from antiquarian dictionaries, forgery, and historical inaccuracies became the benchmark for authentic Romantic expression. Chatterton abandoned the rigid formalism of the 18th century to build his fake history, establishing the linguistic and metric precedents that define the Romantic era.